Alright, y'all. So today we're gonna be reading a book, and this book we're reading has to do with breaking up with your phone. For me, I feel like I haven't been attached to my phone anyway, but I do always have like these urges to go and just check it at times. Like if a notification goes off or whatever it is. Like even if a notification doesn't go off, like there'll be times where I will just check it if I'm bored or whatever it is. Just checking it unnecessarily. Um, so I'm trying to reduce that. I'm trying to reduce that. And the book is called How to Break Up with Your Phone. That's literally the name of the book. And I've been reading it so far. I've been reading it all the way up until chapter 7. That's where I'm at right now. Chapter 7. So 50 pages in. Yeah. And I just want to bring y'all along with this journey. So we're on chapter 7. We're probably going to read, let's see if I can read like 2 chapters. And then I'm about to go cook some pancakes because I'm hungry. So, anyways, chapter 7, your phone is killing your attention span. The first thing to understand about your attention spans is that distraction is our default. Human beings are naturally distractible because in nature, things are often trying to kill us. We want our attention to be drawn to changes in our environments because those changes might indicate a threat. But why is why is staring at our phones so much more distracting and compelling than, say, scanning our surroundings for tigers? In The Distracted Mind, neuroscientist Adam Gazzaley and psychologist Larry Rosen suggest that it's because our phones, and for that matter, the internet, satisfy another evolutionary quirk, our desire for information. Human beings seem to exhibit an innate drive to forage for information in much the same way that other animals are driven to forage for food. Right? Gazzaley and Rosen. This hunger is now fed to an extreme degree by modern technology advances that deliver highly accessible information. In other words, our brains both prefer and are programmed to seek out and be distracted by new information. And that's exactly what our phones encourage them to do. One of the reasons our brains prefer distraction to concentrate is that concentration requires our brains to do 2 difficult things at once. The first is to choose what to pay attention to. The job falls to a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for so-called executive or top-down functions, such as decision-making and self-control. In many ways, the prefrontal cortex is what makes us human. If we didn't have control over our attention, we couldn't think abstract and complicated thoughts. In many ways, the prefrontal cortex is what makes us human. If we didn't have control over our attention, we couldn't think abstract and complicated thoughts. Okay, so it's the main portion or control of how we think. Okay, or controller. Okay. But just like a muscle, the prefrontal cortex can become tired if we ask it too many decisions, a condition known as decision fatigue. When our prefrontal cortex becomes tired, our focus wavers and our minds wander. When our prefrontal cortex becomes tired, our focus wavers and our minds wander. We lose our ability to distinguish between what's important to pay attention to and what's not. The more information we're presented with, the more of a problem this becomes. As a relatively new part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex is also one of the weakest. Under stressful conditions, it tends to freak out and hand the reins to more primitive areas of our brains. Tends to freak out and hands the reins to more primitive. Okay, which is not a good thing, considering that we often reach for our phones out of stress. Oh wow. So it just makes shit worse. Got you. Bad. Basically, just makes everything worse. The second task required for concentration doesn't get as much, attention. But it's just important, if not more so. We need to be able to ignore distractions. Our brains are exposed to an onslaught of stimulation even without man-made distractions like phones or interior distractions like thoughts, sights, tastes, smells, sounds, textures. Our senses are constantly presenting us with new information to act on and absorb. In a way, this makes our ability to ignore distractions even more impressive than our ability to pay attention. We can pay attention to really only one thing at a time, but there is an infinite amount of sensory information that doing so might require us to block. Unsurprisingly, ignoring distractions is tiring work, and the less we practice it, the worse at it we become. When our strength is exhausted and we can no longer block extraneous information, we lose our focus. We go back to our default state of distraction. If you notice that reading a book or a printed newspaper doesn't feel the same as reading the same material on your phone or computer, you're not crazy. It's not the same. As I'm reading this on my computer right now. When we read a book or the paper, most of the distractions we encounter are external. A barking dog or the sound of a vacuum cleaner. This makes it really easy for our brains to decide what's important and to ignore what's not. This also leaves our brains with plenty of available bandwidth to think about and absorb what we're reading. When we read words in print, which is to say without links or ads, we primarily activate the brain areas associated with absorbing and understanding information. But when we read on our phone or computer, links and ads are everywhere. For now, at least, most ebooks are a glorious exception. From the point of view of our attention spans, this is problematic in at least 3 ways. First, every time we encounter a link, our brain must make a split decision about whether to click on it. These decisions are so frequent and tiny that we often don't even notice that they're happening. But we can't make split-second decisions and think deeply at the same time. The two acts use different and competing brain regions. Let me read it again. First, every time we encounter a link, our brains must make a split-second decision about whether to click on it. These decisions are so frequent and tiny that we often don't even notice that they're happening, but we can't make split-second decisions and think deeply at the same time. The two acts use different and competing brain regions. Every decision, no matter how tiny or subconscious, pulls our attention away from what we are reading. This, in turn, makes it hard to absorb the content of what we're reading, let alone to think about it critically or remember it later. Second, unlike a dog barking in the background, online distractions are embedded in what we're trying to focus on. This makes it difficult for our brain to distinguish between what to pay attention to and what to ignore. Trying to absorb the meaning of a word without noticing its link is like trying to count a dog's whiskers while the dog is licking your face. Nearly impossible and almost definitely unpleasant. And third, when mental fatigue causes you to give in to our brain's natural preference for distraction, whether it's by falling for clickbait or swiping over to social media, we reinforce the same mental circuits that made it hard to sustain our focus to begin with. We get better at not staying focused. The result is that the more we read online, the more we teach our brains to skim. This can be a useful skill to hone, especially when we're constantly faced with such information overload. But it becomes a problem if skimming becomes our default, because the better we become at skimming, the worse we get at reading and thinking more deeply, and the harder it is for us to focus on just one thing. Unfortunately, the worse our focus gets, the more valuable we become. Yeah, maybe to social media, or maybe to just people who are trying to maybe to these social media apps who are trying to garner more people like us, who are just easily induced. That's my guess. Because their attention span is so bad, but yeah. Anyways, just as social media companies make money by stealing and then selling your attention, informational websites make money by distracting you. Even subscription-based sites such as newspapers depend on page views and click-throughs for revenue. Even subscription-based sites such as newspapers depend on page views and click-throughs for revenue. That's why online articles contain so many links and why slideshows are so common. Focus isn't profitable. Distraction is. Okay, that was chapter 1. I finished chapter 7. Now we're on to chapter 8. Your phone messes with your memory. I ain't gonna lie, that's a fact. If it's a fact. Because my phone has made it at times hard to remember just certain things. Like if somebody tells me something, I can forget a little bit. I found it being harder for me to remember certain shit. And I think that is for sure due to my phone. Damn. Yeah, and I want to like strengthen my memory a little bit more. I need some tips and tricks on how to do that. If y'all need tips and tricks in the comments, let me know. I'll put it down in the comments. But yeah, no, I'm trying to better my memory, like real bad, because I be trying to remember people's name, but I'm bad. I'm not the best with names. Not the best. But yeah, we're getting there. It's gonna get better. Our brains have two primary forms of memory, short-term and long-term, and our phones affect both. Long-term memory is often described as being like a filing cabinet, according to this analogy. When you want to remember something, your brain does a quick search of its archives, and retrieves that one specific memory from the folder in which it was stored, leaving the rest of the files untouched. But that's not how it works. When we store a long-term memory, it doesn't exist on its own in a manual folder in our brain. It exists in a network of other connected memories called schemas. These networks help us make sense of the world by linking every piece of new information that we acquire to information that we already have. Schemas explain why a single stimulus, say the smell of a cake baking, can trigger a flurry of memories. Schemas also sharpen our thinking by helping us identify commonalities between seemingly disparate. Oh, I'm about to look that up just to make sure I'm pronouncing that right. How you say that, motherfucker? How you say that, motherfucker? Disparate. Disparate. Essentially different in kind, not allowing comparison. Essentially different in kind, not allowing comparison. They inhabit disparate worlds. Okay. Okay, so ident- identifying commonalities between seemingly disparate things. For example, our brains know that a traffic cone and a pumpkin have different purposes, and thus the two objects are connected some schematically by a function. But traffic cones and pumpkins do share a different trait. They both they're both orange. This means that they're schematically linked by color, both to each other and to other orange things, such as tangerines. As this example demonstrates, each piece of information can exist in multiple schemas at once. Tangerines are linked to the schema for the color orange, and thus share a connection with the traffic cone. In the schema for citrus fruit, thus sharing a connection with a lemon. The number of connections is itself important because the more you're able to draw connections between seemingly unconnected things, the more likely you are to have insights. One thought triggers another thought, which triggers another, and you've had a breakthrough. In short, the more nuanced and detailed your schemas are, the greater your capacity for complex thought. But schemas take time and mental space to build. When our brains are overloaded, our ability to create schemas suffers. And guess what overloads our brain? So, okay, basically, the phone limits our ability to draw comparisons or see differentialities within objects or just certain things, or even like remember information with specific details, maybe to where it's not all blurred together, something like that. That's what it sounds like. To understand why heavy phone use messes with our schemas, we need to talk about working memory, a term that often used interchangeably with short-term memory. Broadly speaking, your working memory is everything you're holding in your mind at any given moment. It's a part of your mind that answers the question, what was I what was I just looking for? When you walk into a room, no bab, that really be my when you walk into a room in search of your keys and get distracted along the way. Yeah. Working memory, which can also be thought of as your consciousness, is also the gateway through which every long term memory must pass. Working memory, which also be thought as your consciousness, is also the gateway through which every long term memory must pass. Okay. After all, you can't have a long term memory of an experience unless you were conscious of it in the first place. Here's the first problem: our working memory can't hold on to many things at once. A famous 1956 study on working memory was titled The Magical Number 7 plus or minus 2, suggesting that we're able to hold between 5 and 9 items in our working memory, but more recent estimates put the capacity closer to 2 or 4. As a result of their limited capacities, our working memories are easily overloaded. If I introduce you to 2 people at a party, you probably will be able to remember their names. But if I introduce you to 8 people at once, you probably won't. Likewise, it'd be harder to remember your own phone number if it were presented as an uninterrupted string of digits instead of in 3 distinct chunks. Adding to the challenge, the more information your working memory is trying to handle, which is referred to as your cognitive load, the less likely you are able to remember any of it. That's in part because it takes time and mental energy to transfer information from your working memory to your long-term memory. Right? It takes time and mental energy to transfer information from your working memory to your long-term memory. Because too much shit be going on. In fact, whereas short-term memories are generally created by strengthening the connection between neural circuits, creating long-term memories requires your brain to actually create new proteins. It also takes time and mental energy to connect each new piece of information to all the schemas of which it could be a part. It's time to connect each new piece of information, which it could be a part. Your brain is busy trying to hold too much information in its working memory. If its cognitive load is too great, it won't have the ability to store that information, let alone process it in a way that makes it useful or to create the proteins necessary to transfer the memory into long-term storage. It's like trying to organize your wallet while juggling. You can't. And that brings us to our phones. Everything about smartphones overloads our working memories. The apps, the emails, the news feeds, the headlines, even the home screen itself. A smartphone is a virtual avalanche for the information. The result, short term, is mental fatigue and difficulty concentrating. The long-term consequences are even scarier. As we talked about, when we train our attention on our phones, we miss on everything else going on around us. If you don't have an experience to begin with, then it goes without saying that you're not going to remember it later. What's more, when we overload our working memories, we make it harder for our brains to transfer new information to our long-term memories. This in turn makes it less likely that we'll remember the experiences and information that we did to manage to pay attention to. Lastly, when our working memories are overloaded and our cognitive loads are too great, our brains don't have the resources necessary to connect new information. When our working memories are overloaded and our cognitive loads are too great, our brains don't have the resources necessary to connect new information and experiences to our pre-existing schemas. Not only does this reduce the likelihood of those memories becoming permanent, but the weaker our schemas become, the less likely we are to have insights and ideas. We lose our capacity for deep thought. Okay. That was it. That's going to be it for today. I feel like that was short. It's pretty short. I'm going to read one more chapter. And then I'm going to call it a wrap. So that was chapter 8. This is chapter 9, stress, sleep, and satisfaction. In the past, if a person described herself as feeling happy, sad, excited, anxious, curious, frustrated, ignored, important, lonely, joyful, and existentially depressed within the space of 5 minutes, she likely would have received a diagnosis. Oh shit. But give me 5 minutes on my phone and I can accomplish this and more. Our phones are like Pandora's boxes of emotions. And every time we check them, we open ourselves up to an unpleasant surprise. You could get an email that worries you or a text message about something you forgot to do. Maybe there's a news story that makes you angry, or a stock price that makes you anxious, or a post that makes you sad. A lot of time you'll end up feeling stressed about something you truly cannot control, like politics or stock prices. But in a way, situations in which you could take back control, say by answering that stressful email right then and there, or even worse. In order to restore your sense of equilibrium, you have to remove yourself from whatever experience you have been having. In short, if ignorance is bliss, just fully to look at your phone and your sleep. Every night, 2 to 3 hours before your bedtime, a tiny gland in your brain begins to release a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin tells your body that it's nighttime and makes you sleepy. Your daylight, which is a blue light, hits the back of your eyes in the morning. Your brain stops producing melatonin. You feel awake and ready to start your day. When blue light fades and is replaced by darkness or the yellow glow of incandescent bulbs, melatonin begins to be released again. Guess what else radiates blue light? Screens. When we use our phones or tablets or computers before bed, the blue light tells our brain that it is a daytime and that we should be awake. In other words, when we check our phones at night, we're giving ourselves jet lag. Screen time, particularly in the hour before bedtime, both keeps us up later and harms the quality of our sleep. But the quality of light is just one way that our phones affect our sleep cycles. Most of the things we do on our phones, reading the news, playing games, are stimulating activities. Imagine how difficult it would be to doze off if all the people you follow on social media were in the room. With you. The television was blaring in the background and several friends were having a political debate. That's exactly what you're doing when you bring your phone into bed with you. Phone's effect on sleep are particularly concerning when you consider the health consequences of chronic fatigue, which include increased risk of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and even early death. Indeed, according to the Division of Sleep Medicine at Harvard Medical School, even short-term sleep deprivation can affect judgment, mood, ability to learn and retain information, and may increase the risk of serious accidents and injuries. When you're tired, it's harder for your brain to filter our distractions. You have poor self-control. You're less able to tolerate frustration, and your brain has difficulty deciding what's important to pay attention to and what's not. And short-term sleep deprivation doesn't require you to have one crazy night. Even just a week and a half's worth of sleep even just a week and a half's worth of sleeping 6 hours a night instead of 7 to 9 can, according to the Division of Sleep Medicine, result in the same level of impairment on the 10th day as being awake for the previous 24 hours straight. Which is to say that it can induce impairments in performance equivalent to those induced by a blood alcohol level of 0.10%, beyond the legal limit of alcohol intoxication in the United States. Oh, and if you're thinking about that, this obviously does not apply to you. Keep in mind that the more sleep deprived people are, the more vigorously they may insist that they are not, possibly because their ability to judge their own mental state has been impaired, their ability to be present of themselves. Your phone and flow. Flow is a term coined by the psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I don't know how to pronounce her name. Damn it. Flow is a term coined by the psychologist Blaine to describe the feeling that you get when you're completely and totally engaged in an experience. People can experience flow when they're singing, playing sports, or even working. When you're in a flow, you're so present in the moment that you feel as if you are outside of time. The line between your experience and your mind gets erased. You're unself-conscious. The line between your experience and your mind gets erased. You're entirely absorbed. You're in the zone. Flow leads to the sorts of moments and memories that make life seem rich. If you're distracted, you can't immerse yourself in the experience, which means that you can't, by definition, get into flow. And see, your phones are tools of distraction. This means that the more we spend on our phones, the less likely we are able to experience it. Your phone and creativity. Creativity, that is the process of coming up with new ideas, also requires relaxation and mental space, both of which are hard to come by when you're on your phones. Creativity requires you to be well rested, as Judith Owens, director of sleep medicine at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C., has said. Sleep deprivation can affect memory, creativity, verbal creativity, and even things like judgment and motivation. And creativity is often sparked by boredom, which is another mental state that our phones are great at helping us avoid. To me, the importance of boredom to creativity is summed up by this quote from Lin-Manuel Miranda, the award-winning crazy talented genius behind Hamilton, an American musical. I remember when I was a kid, I was in a 3-hour car ride with my best friend Danny. Miranda told an interviewer for GQ. Before we got into the car, he grabbed a stick from his front yard, and the entire drive home, he made up games with this stick. Sometimes the stick was a man, sometimes a piece in a larger game, or he'd give it voices, pretend the stick was a telephone. I remember sitting there next to him with my Donkey Kong thinking, dude, you just entertained yourself for 3 hours with a fucking stick. And I thought to myself, wow, I have to raise my imagination game. When I read this, part of me thinks that I should be spending more time playing with sticks. And another more cynical part of me thinks, I bet someone is going to make an app for that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I was going to read one more. I'm going to read one more. I'm reading 4 chapters. Let's do it. And we thought we were originally going to read 2, but here we are. Chapter 10, How to Take Back Your Life. We learn to stay with the uneasiness, the tightening, the itch of our cravings. We train in sitting still with our desire to scratch. This is how we learn to stop the chain reaction of habitual patterns that otherwise will rule our lives. Quote by Pema Chodron. So here's the good news. We can undo many of our phone's negative effects. We can rebuild our attention spans. We can get our focus back. We can reduce our stress, improve our memories, and reclaim a good night's sleep. We can change our relationships with our phones and take back our lives from our devices. That's what the next part of the book, The Breakup, is designed to help you do. Before we move on, though, let's talk a bit about the science and philosophy behind the breakup's steps. Mindfulness. Mindfulness is a complicated word to define, but for our purpose, I like the definition put forth by Judson Brewer, Director of Research at the Center for Mindfulness in Medicine, Healthcare, and Society at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. Mindfulness is about seeing the world more clearly, including ourselves. This simple idea is actually quite powerful, especially when it comes to breaking addictions. How powerful? In 2011, Brewer and his colleagues published the results of a randomized, controlled trial designed to test whether mindfulness training could help people stop smoking. More specifically, they wanted to compare mindfulness to the accepted gold standard treatment, the American Lung Association's Freedom from Smoking program. Over the course of 2 years, Brewer randomized nearly 100 smokers into 2 groups. One group was assigned to participate in the freedom from smoking treatment. The other group was trained in mindfulness. First, Brewer taught the mindful smokers about habit loops. They learned to identify their triggers and practice paying attention to their cravings and reactions without trying to change anything. This step alone was surprisingly effective. Just paying conscious attention to the taste of cigarettes, for example, was enough to give one longtime smoker the resolve to finally quit. She moved from wisdom to knowledge, writes Brewer, from knowing in her head that smoking was bad to knowing it in her bones. Next, he taught them to turn toward their cravings rather than run away. Participants practiced recognizing their cravings and relaxing into them. That is, allowing them to happen without trying to stop them. They practiced paying attention to how their cravings made them emotionally and physically feel, and they used this practice as a way to ride out their cravings when they occurred. Brewer also taught participants formal meditation exercises that they were expected to do each day. When Brewer's data was analyzed, it turned out that the people who had received the mindfulness training had quit at twice the rate of the freedom from smoking group. What's more, far fewer people from the mindfulness group relapsed. Far fewer people from the mindfulness group relapsed. Practicing mindfulness can be just as effective, if not more so, when it comes to breaking your addiction to your phones. But that's not all it can do. Paying deliberate attention to your moment-to-moment experience also gives you more fodder for memories that don't involve your phone. It helps you deal with anxiety. It adds richness to your life. And that's why practicing this form of mindfulness is one of the first things that we're going to learn how to do. We'll start by paying deliberate attention to our emotions, thoughts, and reactions without judging ourselves or trying to change anything. We'll notice the invitations that our minds are sending us, and then we'll practice deciding how and if we want to respond. Let me take a second to elaborate. Like overzealous and slightly deranged party planners, our minds are constantly presenting us with invitations to do certain things or to react in certain ways. You hit a traffic jam and your mind invites you to give a fellow motorist the finger. You find yourself alone on a Friday night and your mind invites you to conclude that you are worthless and you have no friends. In other words, what we think of as irresistible impulses are actually invitations being sent by our minds. This is an important insight because once you recognize this, you can ask your mind why it's inviting you to such crappy parties. Why couldn't a traffic jam be an invitation to a mobile karaoke session? Why couldn't a solitary Friday night be an invitation to watch a movie that you can't convince anyone else to see? Not only does mindfulness help us get better at noticing and managing our invitations, but it also enables us to recognize the core emotions, fears, and desires that are driving our addictions, which is an essential step in breaking them. As Brewer explains in The Craving Mind, most addictions stem from a desire to feel better and or to make a bad feeling go away. If you're trying to cut back on your phone, use without first figuring out what you're trying to achieve or avoid. You're dooming yourself to failure. Either you're going to relapse or you're going to find another potentially more destructive habit that achieves the same effect. The more you practice being mindful, the more it becomes obvious that your brain has a mind of its own. I like to think of my mind as a good friend who always happens to be totally crazy. The moment you recognize that you don't have to say yes to every invitation is the moment you gain control over your life, both on and off your phone. How to ride out your phone's cravings. The same approach that works so well for the smokers also works for your phones. If we simply acknowledge our discomfort without trying to fight against it, in other words, if we ride out the wave, our cravings will eventually fade on their own. For example, let's say you catch yourself reaching for your phone Practicing mindfulness means that instead of trying to fight your urge or criticizing yourself for having it, you simply notice the urge and stay present with it as it unfolds. As it does, you can ask questions about it. What does the craving feel like in your brain and in your body? Why are you having this particular urge right now? What reward are you hoping to receive? Or what discomfort are you trying to avoid? What would happen if you reacted to the impulse? What would happen if you did nothing at all? The next time you find yourself tempted to look at your phone, pause instead. Take a breath and just notice the craving. Don't give in to it, but don't try to make it go away. Observe it. See what happens. We must act individually. We must act individually and collectively to make our attention our own again, and so reclaim ownership of very. Let me read it again. We must act individually and collectively to make our attention our own again, and so reclaim ownership of the very experience of living. Okay, that's it. That's it for chapter 10. I'll pick back up on this tomorrow.